Welcome to the Atlanta History Center Virtual Author Talk Series. I'm Virginia Prescott from GPB and your host for these talks. Well, tonight I'm speaking with Julie Weise about Corazón de Dixie, Mexicanos in the U.S. South since 1910. You can purchase the book directly from the University of North Carolina Press. There's a link in the chat to the right of your screen, and you can also find the link there at the Atlanta History Center website. So we are also lucky tonight to have Javier Diaz de Leon. He's the Consul General of Mexico with us this evening. So we are thrilled. And as Julie and the Consul and I are speaking, please do submit your questions. You can use the Q&A feature. It's at the bottom of your screen. And I will try to get to them and integrate them into the conversation as much as possible. So to introduce our speakers, Julie Weise is Associate Professor of History at the University of Oregon, where she teaches courses in race and immigration in the United States and globally. She is currently at work on a book about the U.S. migration in global context. Julie, great to have you with us.
Great to be here. Thank you, Virginia.
And Javier Diaz, thank you for being here. And Javier Diaz de Leon. He has been a member of the Mexican Foreign Service since 1991. He served as Deputy Consul General in San Diego and in New York, and he was Consul General in Raleigh, North Carolina from 2013 to 2016 when he was appointed to that post in Atlanta, where he continues to serve today. We are so honored to have him with us and welcome his perspective on the transnational dynamics of this history. Consul, welcome.
Thank you, Virginia. It's such a thrill to be here with you and Julie talking about this wonderful and this interesting topic.
Yeah, and it's such a fascinating book, Julie. The aspirations, experiences, and advocacy of Mexican migrant workers in the American South nearly before your book. So why did you choose to focus on the South?
I chose to focus on the South actually because I had been working in Mexico City in the Mexican government for someone named Juan Hernandez, who had been an advisor to the president of Mexico for affairs related to Mexicans living abroad. And this was in the early 2000s, which was a very different time in U.S. relations with Mexican immigrants, a more positive time. And I remember Juan Hernandez often saying that travel to the U.S. and meet with governors of southern states, they would often be much more receptive and positive about Mexican immigrants. What can we do to support them and help them? Versus governors in places like Texas and even California. And that really intrigued me as a Californian myself. I believe in the U.S. we're taught a very black and white story of race, and that particularly applies to the way we learn about Southern history. And I was just very intrigued to learn that that this population was in the South, it was growing, and when I began my PhD in history, I decided to see, well, how far back does this go, and what can we learn from that history to inform the present?
Well, so we look, Consul, at the migration which began in the early 20th century, during and after the Mexican Revolution. How did the Mexican government consider its influence over questions of rights and demands from Mexican nationals who went to the U.S. at that time?
Well, it's been an evolving issue, as you can probably imagine, and the way we see the way we usually see that story is that for many years the Mexican government kind of turned their blind eye into the issue of Mexicans migrating and being in the United States. There was even a little bit of a social rejection in Mexico towards people who had left the country and were in the United States. And that happened for a long time in Mexico. They had nickname names like Pocho, and which have kind of like a negative sense into it. And that sort of changed. I would probably say somewhere around the late 20th century, around the late 80s and mid early 90s, when the attitude of the society in Mexico, and then of course government, because that's where it usually goes, government changes perceptions because they are getting some different pressures from society. And I would say probably late 90s 2000s, which is what Julie is talking about, was very, very important time when Mexican government officially turned a different perspective towards the issue.
Yeah, so how about now? Where's the thinking on the role of the Mexican state and your role as a consul on the lives of Mexicans in the U.S. and Georgia right now?
Well, of course, we always see that it's a central part. It's a central part of our foreign policy. It's a central part of our agenda with the United States in terms of working in order to safeguard their rights, safeguard their living standards, and prepare better conditions for them and their families to be, particularly the way we see it, for them to be binational, to have full rights as people who can be, American citizens, those who have that position to become American citizens, but also to retain their Mexican citizenship. So we see a binational empowerment as part of what we see as our agenda towards them.
So it's been a long road to get there. Mexicans and Mexican Americans face bigotry and exclusion, sometimes called Juan Crow at points in the 20th century. There are photos in Julie's book of no Mexican signs on businesses taken by a Mexican Foreign Service officer in Arkansas in the late 40s. But Mexicanos were recruited because of anti-Black racism in the South. Julie, I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on that dynamic and that trajectory.
Sure. Even if we go all the way back to the emancipation of slaves, white Southern planters always had the fantasy that they would recruit immigrants to do the jobs that African Americans had been doing. And at one point in the 19th century, when they sought to recruit Chinese workers, they specifically said, we are bringing in the Chinese to show the Black workers that work can get done without them. In other words, the whole goal is to reduce the bargaining position of African Americans. However, the Chinese did not stay in the fields, neither did the Italians. Many stayed in the area, but not in the fields. And so finally, in the early 20th century, as Mexican labor is becoming increasingly important in the Southwest, Southern planters see this, and they have the idea that they could go to South Texas and do some of the same recruiting. So that was when that trajectory first began in the early 20th century.
So their relation Southerners and the Mexican migrants was very different than that with African Americans. But what did they expect from Mexican workers that perhaps was not in the relationship with African Americans at that time?
Fascinating. I think with African Americans, there was ultimately a resentment that labor had to be negotiated with African Americans due to racist ideas. Their preconception was that African Americans simply feel lucky to have this job, lucky to be earning any money at all, when in fact their previous status had been slavery. And there was deep resentment when African Americans would make demands. And so on the contrary, the idea of bringing in immigrant workers, it was twofold. On the one hand, it was really an attempt to deliberately provide competition with African American workers. But additionally, as the Great Black Migration started, African Americans themselves started seeking a better life outside of the rural South. Often the planters would try to keep them there using violence. However, that became less effective, and particularly during World War I and World War II, as all wars are, great periods of dislocation, recruitment of soldiers, war industries, expanding economies in cities, African Americans were leaving. And so it was a combination of wanting to gain a bargaining advantage with those African Americans who were remaining, as well as in certain times and places, a true inability to retain those workers in the rural South and in the rural South's jobs at all.
World War II is a really important juncture point here. I mean, you do in the book track the patterns of anti-Mexican immigrant sentiment throughout the 20th century, these waves of raids and deportation by the US government while planters are actively recruiting migrant workers. So there's this tension. But if you look at this critical point in terms of US policy for addressing Southern interests, World War II, what's going on in the ground there, and policy makers, how did they respond? This Braceros program, I don't know, Consul, do you want to address that first, that your understanding of the Braceros program?
Well, it was a very important. It's very well known in Mexico. It's basically a program that was opened by the United States during the Second World War to try to replace the needed, workers, labor force in the United States, and this program was put in place in order to attract Mexican workers who could come to the United States and provide labor force during the war. And it's being, there's a lot of controversy around it, but yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about the controversy, and also, Julie, what kind of demands, what was required of growers by the Braceros program, and how does it differ maybe from those that followed?
So when the Bracero program began in 1942, Mexico really had the edge in bargaining. The United States wanted to recruit the workers. The original plan was, let's just open the gates and let Mexican workers in. And it was actually the U.S. State Department that said, I don't think the Mexican government's going to like that. As the consul said, they kind of want to keep their workers at home. So we actually need to negotiate with them. And the Mexican government put forth an extensive list of conditions, things like minimum wage, working conditions, hours, having the transportation paid for, put forth an extensive list of conditions that was frankly superior to anything that domestic workers in the US agricultural industry were receiving at the time. They weren't even really covered by labor law nationally until the 60s at all. No minimum wage, no maximum hours, no conditions, nothing. So at the beginning, the Mexican government had the upper hand, and therefore the Mexican workers came to the US with a set of guarantees. And of particular note in the case of the South was the guarantee against discrimination. So for several years, for example, Texas was blacklisted from receiving braceros, and Arkansas received large numbers of braceros, but the Mexican government always had the bargaining power of, well, we can just cut off the flow of workers that would allow them to do things like fight discrimination, as well as complaints about wages, housing, working, food, a lot of complaints about food, just the conditions of labor generally.
Consul, were there any movements or actions in Mexico at the time to protect workers in a similar way?
I mean, yeah, of course, the Mexican government, like Julie's saying, advocated strongly to try to protect certain safeguards for the workers during the Bracero program. It must be said, of course, that it is probably the last time that the United States and Mexico actually had an agreement, negotiated an immigration agreement between our two countries. Everything that has happened since has been unilateral. On either side of the border, but mostly on this side of the border. But yeah, it's always for Mexico. There was always a couple of priorities. Of course, safeguarding our labor force that was needed for the Mexican economy, but at the same time providing opportunities for these people who come to the United States, because of course Mexico was an ally of the United States in the war, so it was seen as part of Mexico's alliance with the United States in the war effort.
What was fascinating to me is that Julie, as she finds in her book or writes about, the Mexican government targets local efforts at segregation in New Orleans, for example, in the early 20th century, moves on through the Jim Crow South, Arkansas, Mississippi. And through its efforts, Mexican workers are the first agricultural workers in the United States to get a minimum wage. Now, this is in the early 50s. I would say it's probably safe to say that US history, this is part of US history that not a lot of Americans certainly know. Is this kind of transnational advocacy something taught in Mexican history? Is there a general awareness of this kind of work on behalf of migrant workers in the US?
I would say that it's being a larger conversation and a larger talk about this in Mexican schools and etc. during the past, I would say the past 20, 25 years. Mm-hmm. Like I was saying before, it wasn't so much a case before that. And I think it has a lot to do with the strengthening and the empowerment of Mexican migrants in the United States, because as they became more organized and their economic and social power towards Mexico became larger, they were able to force the Mexican government to pay attention to their needs and to their tribulations.
If you have questions for us and would like to be a part of this conversation, please do enter them into the Q&A. It's at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to integrate them. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. There were some early collective actions that we saw, strikes and demands in Arkansas in the late 40s. Julie, you talked a little bit about some were blacklisted by the Mexican government, some of these farmers who might have been abusive, but how did the Southern farmers themselves and the white citizens in these places respond?
So what we saw at first when Mexicans would come into these communities is that, as you mentioned, the no Mexican signs would go up. The presumption would be that these Mexican workers would be treated the way that African Americans were treated. And And interestingly, the Mexican workers, when we listen to oral histories with Mexicans and African Americans that were in the area at the time, the social community that formed was in fact between Mexicans and African Americans. Mexicans and African Americans were doing a lot of the same work. Mexicans felt more comfortable even once they were eventually allowed into white establishments, which I'll explain in a moment. They still basically preferred to hang out with Black people. That was where they felt more comfortable. However, on the political level, they wanted to be treated like first-class citizens. They knew that their agreement guaranteed them freedom from discrimination. And so they called, the Mexican government had opened a consulate in Memphis specifically to attend to these workers that were in mostly Arkansas, a bit in Mississippi, but mostly Arkansas. And there's even stories I found in the archives of Mexican workers walking 50 miles to Memphis in order to see their consul. They had a variety of concerns, as I mentioned: wages, food, healthcare, abuse, verbal and physical abuse. But one of them was that in these towns, they were not allowed to sit with white people in the movie theater. They were not allowed to go to white restaurants and white bars. And they fought that, and the consul would come and basically say, we're gonna take the workers away if you don't stop this. And so when one thinks now about the many anti-immigrant ordinances that have spread through the South, well, if we go back about 70 years, we get the opposite. We get local ordinances where actually anyone who was caught discriminating against a Mexican worker would be fined. Not the worker, the white person that's doing the discriminating. Where local bar owners and restaurant owners and movie theater owners would have to sign affidavits saying we're gonna permit the Mexicans to come in. And so they did really achieve that legal framework. Within the legal framework of Jim Crow, they did achieve that white status, but that doesn't mean really that anything changed interpersonally. And so they still, even as they pursued this technical white status, they still actually preferred to hang out with African Americans. And so that's a part of how we, as historians, we ask, an important question we ask is, at what points have Mexican Americans bought into white supremacy, and at what points have they resisted it? And through these types of examples, we see how complex and complicated it is, that they wanted first-class citizenship within Jim Crow, but at the same time, it's not that they were necessarily personally harboring those beliefs, because in fact, even once they could go to the white restaurants, why would they go to a restaurant where they're going to get dirty looks the whole time? They preferred to be with African Americans.
Consul, you're nodding. What are you hearing here?
No, I was just thinking that a lot of what Julie is saying has a lot to do with how the migration phenomenon has shifted. I always say that it's a moving target, and I would, for many years and for many decades, Mexican migration to the United States was a circular phenomenon. It was people who would come to the United States, work, but in their minds they were here temporarily. They would come here to work maybe in the fields. The Bracero program, by definition, was a temporary migration program. It wasn't designed for these workers to remain in the United States. So they always saw themselves as being here in the United States temporarily, and migration was a circular phenomenon. And that changed in the middle of the 80s, in the 1980s, when it shifted because of some unilateral policies that were done by the United States, and it broke the circularity of migration, and now we have a very different phenomenon.
A question here from Alexis. Are Mexicans who have been in the South since the early 1900s generally still affiliated with their heritage, or have they assimilated fully into American culture in general?
What a question. When we look at those Mexicans who came to New Orleans, the Mexican Revolution was in the 19-teens, and that was really the first major beginning of Mexican immigration to the US. When we look at those who came to New Orleans in the 19-teens, when we look at those who came to the Mississippi Delta as cotton workers in the 20s and a bit into the 30s, as the consul said, particularly among agricultural workers, the majority did move on. But those who stayed, the vast majority assimilated into the white side of the line. They fought in many cases for the opportunity to do that, and when they won the opportunity, they did it. And in the Mississippi Delta today are many, many families with Hispanic last names who would be considered white people. Someone looks at them, sees that their skin is darker, knows that they have a Hispanic last name, They might say something like, granddad came from Texas, might be the way of discussing it. However, the fact that their skin is darker and they have a Hispanic last name does not conflict with the idea that they are considered white in that context. And some have spoken to me about how much later on, when newer waves of immigrants came, was maybe the first time that they would be pushed to confront, well, who are you? What are you? Where are you from? It's been a dance for them. They have chosen this side, and in order to stick with it, has required a dance and a constant policing in some ways of their own behaviors and social relationships in order to stay on that side of the line. And there are definitely exceptions. I have met some Mexican Americans, third and fourth generation Southerners, who have had a hunger to learn more about their Mexican heritage, who have strongly identified that way. But those people are more the exception. And there were also small numbers that assimilated with Black communities as well. But among those who stayed and married and made families, the larger number assimilated onto the white side.
That's one of the things that came very clear to me in this book. There is no monolithic Mexican perspective or Mexican experience, of course, but it's also highly regionalized. I think is interesting because you start in New Orleans, you go to the Mississippi Delta, to Arkansas, and then to Georgia. And of course, it would be fascinating to talk about Georgia now because, as the consul just alluded to, things change, especially the 80s. This Braceros program ends in 1964 after bringing 4 million Mexican men to the United States, but then they just become undocumented immigrants. So where we see some collective action for workers' rights, especially taking off, after the civil rights movement, the civil rights action taking shape in California, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta. The consul, did the Mexican state support those kind of movements for independence for farmers?
I mean, the Mexican government will always have to be very careful of not doing anything that would be perceived as an interference in domestic United States policies. But the line has to always go as far as possible in terms of providing support to people who are from Mexican migrants who live in the United States. So, for example, our policy towards supporting migrant agricultural workers in the Chicano program, in the Chicano movement, in California, would be something that the Mexican government would see as in good eyes, as long as that movement was something that was a movement towards the reivindication of rights of immigrant workers or Latino or Mexican workers.
A sort of related question here from Tom. You mentioned earlier the resentment or aversion to people leaving Mexico. They were considered disloyal in some way. Tom says, I didn't realize there was an aversion to immigrants leaving Mexico. When was IME created, and was that part of the change? Can someone clarify for me what IME is?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, he knows his stuff, our friend who's making the question. IME is an office that was created in the Mexican government right around the early 2000s when Julie was working around there by the administration of Vicente Fox. And that was an office of the Mexican government that purposely had the mission of providing assistance and creating programs to attend to the needs of Mexican migrants abroad, but of course, mostly in the United States, which tells you a lot because, of course, we're talking about, the 2000, the year 2000, which is when Vicente Fox came into office. That was the first time that officially Mexico had a government agency dedicated to migrants. And that tells you a lot about the political shift that this meant for the Mexican government. Yeah. And by the way, IME means Institute of Mexicans Abroad. By the way, I was the executive director of that for a while.
Yes, you've had many jobs in this field, certainly. But I want to get back to Georgia, the sort of these resentments and fears of agitation that were going on in some other regions, not the case in Georgia, where dependence on migrant labor boomed between the 1960s and the 1990s, along with vegetable crops. Julie, you describe a fragile pact, I think is the term you use, between South Georgia growers and migrants. So what was this pact, and why was it different in Georgia?
Sure. I think the bigger piece that we need to have as context is that the current political alignment around immigration politics in the US is really new, by which I mean brand new. So historically, anti-immigrant movements in the United States came more actually from the left, from the labor movement, fearing competition, while the party of business, and of course this has shifted as to which party was which, but the right, the party of business, was always more of the party that was encouraging immigration, and specifically immigration from Mexico. So the Bracero program, for example, was typically opposed by the left, and was promoted rather by the white segregationist Southern senators who saw this labor force as essential to their agricultural constituencies. So what we saw in Georgia was really the continuation of that. But what's interesting is how long it hung on. In other words, this alliance between white agricultural interests and white evangelical churches as well, with a stance that was accepting of having Mexican immigrants in town as an economic necessity, really lasted almost until, it started to break down in the early 2000s, and I believe has likely broken down entirely now, although I would love to hear more on that from the consul, who's more up to date on that than I am. But what we saw was essentially, as these workers were being recruited from Texas and Florida beginning in the 1960s, was that so they begin to be recruited in the 1960s, largely on a seasonal basis. And then it's really in the 1980s that they start to send their children to school. And I just want to acknowledge, I'm seeing here as the questions come in, I'm seeing that two people who lived this are here with us. Jorge Gomez, whose parents were crew leaders that brought people to Georgia in the 60s and 70s, as well as Israel Cortez, who came with his family in that time period. So hi, Jorge and Israel, and if you have any thoughts to add, please put them in the chat and I can share them, especially anything I get wrong. So what happened was people came in, it was the period of desegregation, of the forced desegregation of schools in the 1970s and 80s. And in the middle of all of this sort of racial turmoil and strife between Black and white people in rural Georgia arrive Los Mexicanos, as originally Mexican Americans from Texas, followed by Mexican immigrants. And essentially what happened was, between the growers and the white churches, the small number of Catholics, as well as the larger number of Protestants and Protestant evangelicals, really embraced the cause of Mexican immigrants, sort of celebrating them as, on the one hand, essential to the local economy, and on the other hand, sort of hardworking family values. And there was definitely an implicit contrast there to African Americans and the way that these constituencies were portraying African Americans at the time. For their part, African Americans at this point really, for the most part, are done with agricultural labor, other than the elderly people, really. It is no longer an interest, really, in the African American community at this time. So African Americans are not begrudging this new labor force at all. And if anything, middle-class African Americans are sort of saying, hey, look how far we've come. We no longer do the agricultural work. The Mexicans are here to do it instead, as a sort of sign of our progress as African Americans. So this was sort of meeting everyone's needs. Meanwhile, Mexicans were having a lot more economic success than they had been in Texas, as well as facing less sort of overt racism and racial violence than they were in the Southwest. So one woman spoke to me, my son used to get beaten up by the white kids in high school in Texas. And once we came to Georgia, yeah, they weren't inviting us over for a barbecue, but they weren't beating us up either. And so this really was a fragile piece that formed. And even once we started to see the growth of anti-immigrant movements nationally in the 90s, white conservative leaders in rural Georgia held firm to the idea that the Mexicans need to be here and they're going to be here.
Israel, I remember in particular from your book writing about going to school and being treated like an oddity and being afraid of bringing home soft tacos from home to lunch because he thought that he would be looked at as strange. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about that kind of process of the relationships, because this is one of the interesting things about the book. Because there is so little written official history, you're looking at letters, you're looking at photo albums showing people's daily lives and their relationships with the farmers of South Georgia. I think different in South Georgia, perhaps because the farms were smaller. There's more engagement, I think you point out in the book. But can you elaborate a little bit on where those relationships brought the the sense of who the workers were and who the planters were?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this exactly as you said, Virginia. The farms were smaller in Georgia than they were, let's say, in nearby Florida. In Florida, there was a tremendous amount of abuse of Mexican workers by sort of crew leader, middlemen type figures, or foremen. Really, is a better way of putting it. Of course, we can't. There was, of course, abuse in Georgia as well. But in Florida, I'm talking about outright slavery. Murder of workers, that type of thing. And we don't have any evidence that anything at that level was occurring in Georgia. On the contrary, in oral history interviews with workers and their families, once someone had been doing this work for a while, they could often kind of rise up, organize other workers, make a little more money as a crew leader, develop longstanding relationships with farmers. And they really spoke about, how they felt that the farmers that were their bosses really saw them as human beings and saw them as something more than workers. And of course, that is, one slice of the pie. At the same time, we had farmers who were bringing in Mexican workers under the H-2A program, which was sort of like a continuation of the Bracero program. And one farmer I had the opportunity to interview spoke about how she would throw Christmas parties and Easter parties for the workers. And they were all one big happy family. And then I was literally in the archives in Mexico, and the Mexican consul in Atlanta is writing that workers are saying that exact farmer is having armed security guards with guns that doesn't let them leave the premises. Mm-hmm. So it certainly depends, and this was in the 90s. So it certainly depends who you ask. But certainly there was enough of this more paternalistic type of relationship to keep workers from organizing, because they did have that protection if they didn't organize. And on the other hand, the farmers were really willing to stick their necks out with the sort of bubbling up anti-immigrant movements that were happening. Local leaders were really willing to stick their necks out and say, these people are here, they work here, they go to church, and we're not going to do anything to change that.
Mm-hmm. Not quite so in the more industrial cities of North Georgia and the Atlanta suburbs and exurbs. There were KKK campaigns in some places, outright violence and killings of some Mexicans. Now, Consul, I think that you were working in the Foreign Service at the time when there was at least one of those murders. What kind of actions from the Mexican government? What is the response in those kind of cases?
I mean, whenever there's some horrible case like that, of course, Mexico immediately reaches out to at the highest level with the United States government. But of course, we put all the resources that we can in order to make sure that the families and the people involved and the people who have been victims of this receive all the proper legal advice that they need. And the issue is, of course, making sure that due process is done. That is in terms of the case itself. But of course, it has to do a lot with engagement with the authorities in the United States and keeping a close contact with them and getting information on how law is being enforced in the United States. How can we ensure the people who are victims of this can get justice?
Well, we've been talking a little bit about how the relationship with the has devolved, certainly, between those who are, or maybe the farmers, the planters whose interests are to have cheap Mexican labor, basically to maximize profits, have a powerful voice, or did have a powerful voice for a long time. But as those kind of interests have shrunken, and for political reasons, we can certainly talk about that. What about the relationship with the Mexican government and your actions and those kind of diplomatic back channels that we don't get access to?
Well, for example, in terms of course, all the diplomatic relation with the United States happens at multi-level, because we have a relationship and a dialogue at the highest level in Washington with the administration, whoever is in power in Washington, but also at the local level and with business sectors, etc. So, for example, a few years ago, when there was a lot of talk about in the United States about some immigration reform, one of the key elements in that was a very powerful movement of agricultural owners and agricultural industry that were very interested in finding some sort of immigration reform, and they called their proposal ag jobs. So there's always been a very strong push from the agricultural industry in the United States to get certain things in terms of changes in the immigration law in order for them to be able to get consistency and certainty access to labor, because that's what they need. And then many times, because of immigration laws in the United States on immigration enforcement, and many times that industry in the United States and here in Georgia particularly have been very concerned that their certainty to have access to that labor could be in danger. And that's when we have engaged a lot with them. And that's what H-2A program is, which that Julie was talking about.
The H-2A program also, though, it does put more of the onus on the farmers to pay for recruitment, pay for travel, to provide water, to provide toilets. I mean, all things that cost money. And from Julie's description, correct me, Julie, if I've got this right or wrong, that these farmers didn't necessarily go in for those kind of programs. They were sort of basing this on relationships that they'd established, sometimes year by year. This is the pro-immigrant conservatives. This is something that not a term that we hear a whole lot.
No, but I think it's very real. I mean, I think the position based in terms of how that immigration takes place. So I would say probably, I mean, there's this large, in my experience here in the South, I've encountered a lot of agricultural owners and industry people in the South who are very adamant and strongly in favor of H-2A program, which is a legal temporary immigration program for people to be recruited in Mexico, get a visa, come to the United States in order for them to work here in the fields. However, it must be said, first of all, it's very cumbersome. It involves a lot of red tape. It is expensive for the owners to do the process. I was once I remember very well a conversation with one leader of agricultural industry in North Carolina when he was describing to me the process they had to go through in order to justify and get those visas. And he was telling me that one of the things they need to do is to demonstrate that they could not hire locally people to take those jobs, and they needed to bring these people from Mexico in order to do these jobs in the field. And I asked them, how do you do that? Well, so I advertised the jobs in the newspaper. So I advertised hundreds and hundreds of jobs here in North Carolina to pick up the crops. And they told me, I mean, last month I advertised 400 jobs to pick up, berries, and I got 2 people who applied, and those two people I sent down to the fields, and they were gone the next week. So for them this is a necessity.
Okay, so we've got a couple questions here I'd like to get to, and I don't want to run out of time. But one, I think I can address right now. The breakdown in early 2000, I think Julie was talking about, does this have some roots in 9/11 and terrorism? And I just want to more like the 90s, like it wasn't 1992 that Clinton did the first hardline bipartisan immigrant reform, trying to track immigration and keep it to a minimum. So I think it was a little bit earlier. Julie, have I got that right?
Yeah, so your question, you cut out for a moment, but your question is really about sort of, and I see another one here in the chat about sort of what
in the Q&A, and you're looking in the chat. So
yeah, but I think it's the same question of what's the roots of the change, right? Of the change in attitude. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I think that the roots of the change, I think, is really important. And yes, let's go with that.
Okay. So I actually trace it back to something that was very formative in my own life growing up in California, which was Proposition 187 in 1994, an anti-immigrant ballot initiative that passed with 60% of the vote in California, and it never went into effect because of unconstitutionality, and it is often considered the beginning of the end of the Republican Party in California, because that is when many Latinos naturalized and did so as Democrats, because that had been a Republican-backed initiative, although also in some ways bipartisan as well. That people like Dianne Feinstein had supported it at one point before they turned away. So that was California's a big state, and that discourse was less about they're taking our jobs. It was a middle class driven political movement that was they're taking our tax dollars. They're taking the seats in our children's schools. They're taking the space at the park that I want to go to on Sunday. It was about immigrants being undeserving consumers of public services, much more so than they're taking our jobs, because the political base of that initiative was not really people that were in competition with Latino immigrants. So interestingly, in the files of Mexico's governors, I found in 1995, the year after 187, a letter writing campaign from Cobb County, Atlanta suburbs, to the governor. And a lot of the letters said things like this: I moved here from the suburbs of Los Angeles. If you walk down the streets I grew up on, it looks like you're in Mexico City. It is so disgusting. It's been taken over by Mexicans. We don't want Georgia to become Georgiafornia. And this was clearly a little organized letter writing campaign. Just a little blip that never went anywhere. But it was a signal of this changed politics around immigration, that it became a much more pervasive anti-immigrant movement from many different parts of society, and not just a sense of, oh, I'm a working class person and the Mexican immigrants are taking my jobs. Mm-hmm. And so I really see that then ricochets into welfare reform with Bill Clinton taking a lot of benefits away from legal immigrants. It changes the national discourse. And this is when we really start to see the realignment that brings us to where we are today, where the Republican Party is strongly associated with anti-immigrant sentiment, and the Democratic Party strongly opposing that. And so I really see it as the nationalization of immigration politics, where once things had been very much negotiated locally, national media, and then pretty quickly national social media, which of course we talk so much about today, those echo chambers, begin to develop national anti-immigrant organizing networks, begin to politicize the Republican Party very clearly in that direction, no matter what the farmers have to say. There's a lot of winking and nodding. Don't worry, I'm not going to raid your field. You're going to get your workers. Don't worry. This is just our political stance. And I really just see it as the nationalization of what had been issues that had been negotiated on a very local level by individual church leaders, individual mayors. Something that had been very local became national. And I think an amazing example of that is that when Georgia passed with Republican leadership, an anti-immigrant state bill in 2011, the ACLU sues, and who joins the suit but Paul Bridges, the mayor of Uvalde, Georgia, small town white Republican mayor, joining a lawsuit with the ACLU, basically saying we can't have this type of anti-immigrant politics in Georgia because these are our neighbors, these are the people we go to church with, these are our employees, these are the people without whom our economy doesn't exist. And that seems so weird from the outside, but from the perspective of rural Georgia, it actually makes perfect sense. Paul Bridges, this mayor, represented actually decades of what had been going on with immigration in southern Georgia. There was always a condition: the Mexican workers don't organize, don't get any ideas from Cesar Chavez, but if you're going to sort of keep things calm, we will do the same. And I would just, I don't know what light the council might be able to shed, but I really, things have changed a lot since 2011 with immigration politics and rural white conservatives in this country. And I would just love to know the people that I interviewed 10 years ago who said, I don't care if someone's undocumented, you're here. Jesus said we're all similar. Mm-hmm. I would just love to have the opportunity to speak with them today, with some of those growers as well, to really know how they're thinking about it now.
Consul, did you want to add anything to that?
I would say, like I was saying before, about the moving target, and every immigration wave has different characteristics. And the biggest wave of migration from Mexico to the United States happened in the 80s, mostly in the 80s, early 90s to the United States. So some of the factors that changed, I think, also the perception or the attitude towards it. First was the numbers. The numbers in the 80s and 90s compared to any time before were way different, a lot larger. Second of all, the migration that happened during the 80s, 90s to the United States, and particularly here to the South in the 90s, were not mostly immigrants who came to the United States to work on the fields. They came here to work in industry, mostly construction and services. And that probably generated a lot of that tension that was not so present before, because they were a lot more visible in the suburbs by the people in Cobb County, like the ones that Julie's talking about. So it's a very different phenomenon in terms of their destiny, destination, the jobs they're doing here. And of course, the other very different thing is that this migration was, a lot more permanent, because migration, like I said before, the circular model of coming and going was broken because of enforcement in the border. So by then, people who came to the United States were mostly forced to come here illegally, and their situation was very different. So that generated a lot of that, friction that changed policy and attitude in the United States, I think.
All right, there are two questions that I want to try and knit together here. One is about when the transition in Georgia from agricultural work to factories, chicken butchering and construction. And similar question or similar statement, I would suggest that the transition from the Georgia Republican Party from pro-immigration to anti-immigration coincided with the shift in power from rural agricultural Georgia to the Atlanta suburbs in the mid-2000s.
Agree.
That sounds right. That sounds right to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was it? So let's look at that. However, we've got a wrap, but this is the thing that we've seen this industry dependent on an agricultural labor force of embrace this avowedly anti-immigration precedent, right? And in June, the administration extended the shutdown of new immigration during coronavirus. But administration policy is somewhat different when it comes to agricultural labor. So whereas we've seen this nationalization of the immigration question away from the localized, and certainly a lot of posturing of being anti-immigrant, where is the real political power? Julie?
Yeah. I mean, I think you've captured it, that yes, there was this massive shutdown of immigration, but not H-2A, not the ag workers. And in fact, the Trump administration has tried to make it even easier, tried to reduce the rates that they make, the wages, that kind of a thing. So yes, it does seem that there has been a lot of winking and nodding to agricultural interests. Certainly the overall climate has discouraged people from coming to the US undocumented. And so it is harder for industries that depended on undocumented workers to have access to those workers in terms of just the general climate and the things happening at the border. But have we really seen large-scale, Consul, have we really seen large-scale raids of agricultural fields in harvest season when it really matters? Have we seen that, Consul?
I was exactly thinking about that, Julie. I mean, I've been diplomatic in the United States for about 20 years. I can't recall ever being involved and being, aware of a immigration raid happening at an agricultural field.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, most cases happen at poultry plants or industrial factories. Those sort of places are the places where that sort of immigration raids happen. But in an agricultural field, that I don't remember ever seeing that, and that tells you a lot about the power and the muscle that the agricultural industry has in Washington.
Mm-hmm. Maybe
and I'll just say, when they tried in the late 90s, they tried to raid the Vidalia fields. They raided the Vidalia fields in the late 90s. They didn't arrest that many people, but it was enough to scare the workers out of the fields. And basically, Senator Paul Coverdale of Georgia, Representative Saxby Chambliss, they basically are on the phone with the INS at the time, the Immigration Enforcement Agency, saying, what are you doing? You can't do this. And they were speaking openly. These are just honest farmers trying to get their onions to market. And so basically, it was also sort of well known. Jesse Helms in North Carolina made it known that immigration enforcement was not welcome in his state. So these politicians have used their influence. It's not that there's never been an attempt to raid these fields, and it has happened, but what is really the results of that? Has there ever been a real attempt to actually cut off this labor force? I would say that the answer has been no throughout the 20th century.
I agree.
Consul, we're over time, but quickly, is the idea of Mexicanos, Mexican migrants working in the U.S., lodging complaints to you at the Mexican consulate about treatment by a Southern planter, is that a thing of the past? Is that anything that even comes to you anymore in this climate?
Well, that's something that always happens. We get that all the time. We have a working group that we meet regularly at the consulate with organizations that provide legal assistance to farm workers. And we see that all the time, and we hear a lot of that. It's a very difficult issue because for us to get access to those workers, we have to get access to the farms, of course, and the farmers are not always happy to see us when we get there. But it is always a struggle. It is always a struggle because, of course, if you hear certain people, they'll tell you that it's Disneyland, that the farm is a wonderful place where everybody's happy, but there are a lot of other people, advocates and people who are very concerned about the situation of workers in the fields and agricultural workers in Georgia.
Javier Diaz de Leon, the Consul General of Mexico here in Atlanta, thank you so much. An honor speaking with you tonight.
Thank you, Virginia. Thanks a lot.
And Julie Weise, thank you so much.
Thank you, Virginia, and thank you, Consul. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you, Julie.
Purchase a copy of Corazón de Dixie directly from the UNC Press at the link in the chat at the right of your screen. Also at the link provided at the History Center's website. Now, a number of you did ask questions that we didn't get to them, many of them about Mexican history. If you want to write them to Julie, is that okay for you, Julie?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because of that reason, we can't get to all of them. We wanted to focus on the heart of Dixie. And thank you so much for tuning in tonight. You can join us on Thursday for Tim Weiner. He's going to be talking about the folly and the glory, America, Russia, and political warfare. From 1945 to 2020, rather, with Politico's Natasha Bertrand. That should be a good one. On Monday, I'm going to be speaking with the New York Times reporter Sarah Maslin-Neer about Horse Crazy, the story of a woman and a world in love with an animal. And on Tuesday, October the 6th, the former CIA director John Brennan will talk about his new book, Undaunted. You can find a full schedule of virtual author events and Zoom links at atlantahistorycenter.com. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Please send your remaining questions to Julie. You can go to Corazón de Dixie to her website and find a contact button there. Thanks again.
Thank you.